Okay, so Bill, we've got time for open mic? Yeah? Okay, so questions, please.
They'll load it for you.
Yeah. See, there's going to be so much.
Come on, you
Oh,
got
yeah,
it.
so Dr. Lee, there was a question about, I think, can we repeat the question, which was about health impacts of toxicity?
The state of the science? It's the state of the science in the relationship with blue-green algae and the impact on human neurological diseases, for example, ALS.
Here, I got it. I got it.
Okay, so in terms, cyanobacteria can make different types of toxins. One of them is neurotoxin. So, so far it has known several kind of types of neurotoxin. One is anatoxin, saxitoxin, BMAA. Those three are the most known. And so saxitoxin is quite classical toxin. It has been known from marine too, such as in Florida, especially consumption of seashells. And anatoxin is another neurotoxin. So it has been sporadically reported, like especially animal sudden death across the US. So especially animals, humans know that if there's a bloom, we don't really contact or drink, but animals, they drink the water, especially if they ingest a kind of chunk of those scum. So pet owners saw the sudden death, and then from the biopsy, they found that like chunk of the kind of algae stuff from their stomach. So neurotoxins are quite dangerous because if we are ingest or expose quite amount, and then it can cause like a sudden symptoms. So animals, we see sudden death. BMAA is very kind of interesting topic because first it was reported from Guam, certain tribe, they have high level of Alzheimer's. So BMAA is known for linkage to Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, and ALS. But the lab study, it is a clear linkage with that kind of neurotoxicity. Then the question is how people are exposed to. So BMAA is known through like a food. So as a Guam, they know that the cycade goes to consumed by flying fox. And then the certain people, they eat their brain as their gourmet food. So that, or they make the flour from cycade fruit. So that was first reported, and then it got attention. So that is kind of a study. Then in the US, more like a spatial study that we did with like a ficosane and then microcystin and a liver. So in the US, that kind of ALS and that kind of ALS study, spatial study was reported a couple of years ago, if I remember correctly. So that was from New Hampshire, so there are certain cluster, not evenly distributed throughout the state. So the hypothesis was the proximity to the lake that has harmful algal bloom, probably cyanobacteria. So they found there is a kind of correlation, proximity to the lake and then ALS. So that is another like a spatial correlation. As far as I know, Cleveland Clinic is going on. They are conducting that kind of human test. So we will wait a couple of years. I think they will find out whether they kind of linkage. So that's kind of where we are. So the reason why neurotoxin is relatively less studied, marine, it has been studied a lot, marine. But freshwater cyanotoxin, that kind of related neurotoxin is less studied because many reasons. One is when EPA, for example, they test across the US, including Ohio, the public lake or drinking water source. The neurotoxin, those three things are less detected especially SOx toxin and toxin is less detected compared to microcystin. Maybe because they are less present in the water, or the toxin itself are less stable, so maybe they can degrade it much quicker. Third is technology to detect properly. So BMAA, again, it's quite interesting thing, but from my lab with our recent study looking at especially drinking water sludge, so we tested, and then we found not just microcystin, but multiple profile of cyanotoxin. So that we including SOx toxin and BMAA. So I think BMAA is kind of getting a lot of attention, not just here, but actually globally. So I think that is, so when we're talking about cyanotoxin and toxicity, okay, so the toxicity from animal study has been known, and when we test water, it's there. Then the question is where we are, how we can expose to. Probably drinking water exposure would be low, because all the after drinking water treatment plants put the finished water, other than the Toledo incident, the finished water may have, probably not. Then where can we expose to? So exposure question is really public health question. So exposure doesn't happen, we don't need to worry about. Exposure happen, we have to worry about it. So that's why recreational water direct exposure, it is important. And then other than ingestion, inhalation is another way, because recent studies show that those like balloons can be aerosolized, so we can inhale. So I think a recent study reported that the nasal swab shows presence of those microcystis. So that is another new research area. And the dermal contact is another one. So I think the high level, more than advisor level, is important, but what if the chronically exposed to low level? That is another question. So that's why the proximity, living close to the water, always gives another layer of risk, because not just ingestion, but also inhalation and dermal contact. And then all those, it can be bioaerolized and then drop somewhere. Our recent study from our lab showing from the water, and then they can colonize interested environments, especially soil. So I think, so there are many ways. I think exposure pathway is another area, black box, we have to find out whether we are truly exposed or not. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mark Rossi, Chippewa Lake. We're a volunteer organization that has learned a great deal from what you've been doing at Buckeye Lake. We're about 10 years behind Buckeye Lake and all the volunteer initiatives. My question is really for Linda. Linda, I could use your advice. A couple years ago when we got involved in this, we figured, well, the big problem will be nutrient loading coming from agriculture. So we approached our county soil and water district. And what we seem to sense is that soil and water is kind of caught in the middle. Their board, as you know, is elected by farmers. Soil and water, when we ask certain things, they tend to clam up. And so my first question is, how do farmers perceive soil and water districts? Are they friend or foe from the farmer's point of view?
From a farmer's point of view, soil and water conservation districts are friends.
Okay.
The problem with soil and water NRCS programs, there's a certain amount of funding available. Like 4% of farmers ever get any money from these programs, though. And like I learned to deal with them because in order to be apply for EQIP money through NRCS or grass waterways through SWCD, they were required to have a nutrient management plan. That is probably why I did most of my plans, because otherwise farmers aren't going to do them voluntarily. So yeah, but no, farmers definitely see SWCD as friends, But they are kind of caught in the middle of, you know, we're supposed to be providing these fundings, and we're trying to help the farmers, and yeah, it's.
So when as a volunteer organization, when we ask Soil and Water for, well, what % of the farmers in our small watershed have BMPs, and they give us a number, they say it's, I don't know, 64%. How do we really know whether it's just a check the box versus have they actually implemented BMPs?
Yeah, soil and water, if they have numbers, it's just through observation.
Okay.
There wouldn't be any official numbers on how many farmers have BMPs because they can do them themselves. And I worked with a lot of farmers who said, I'm not waiting for them, you know, I'm gonna go ahead and ply on my own land. So, actually, Farm Services Agency may be a better source for you to find out how many acres are in practices, because they are the financial side. They're the ones who make the payments to the farmers, and they should be going out and checking to see that the practices are in place. So
Okay.
FSA may be a better source for your questions.
Thank you.
All right.
Hi, my name is Mark Dillay. I'm the current president of the Ohio Wetlands Association. Thank you all for being here today. Obviously, you're not going to be surprised to hear that the Ohio Wetlands Association is supportive of these endeavors to preserve and restore wetlands within the state. We're an education and advocacy organization. We want to see these things happening. And I wanted to hear from everyone on the board as to what you see as maybe the single largest obstacle to really gaining traction for some of these ideas and getting an increasing rate of restoration and wetliculture onto the landscape. See if there's any kind of consensus among the group.
It's, for us, getting somebody to give up their land. We've had, like I said, a variety of GLRI projects. We had to get money from other sources to buy the farmers' land from them so that we could actually own it ourselves in order to do these projects. And it's been very difficult to get farmers to be interested in this. Now, there are some people that are willing to kind of like sell land, like in the city of Defiance. There were a few places where we were looking, and the folks there wanted a huge amount of money to be able to do that. And so that was one of the problems. I mean, the projects that we put in work pretty well. And if you look at OEPA and EPA, they really like them. They would like us to do them in other locations as well. Getting those locations is very difficult. And part of it has to do with where these places are located, because if you're going to do something, you have to be able to get there. You have to have the road, you have to have the access, you have to have maybe electricity, because one of the things I was going to ask Sam, I'm sorry, but in his business model, for us, we had to pump the water. And I don't know how you do it around here without pumping water to get it from the ditches up to the wetland. That's over $1,000 a year for the 7-acre wetland that we put in just for the pump. And the pumps have to be replaced every few years. That's a few more $1,000 that actually has to go into that. And so for me, it's access. It's people who are willing, some people are willing to give you access, but you can't get there. And I'm on the MAC committee up here, and we looked at a whole bunch of places where we could actually do these projects, and a lot of them just weren't suitable either. And so it's trying to find some place that's suitable, having access, and then finding somebody who's willing to sell you or allow you to do the project.
This might be a little off topic, but I know one of the difficulties we're dealing with in Licking County is in order to set up a good watershed plan and really be able to access more federal and state money, we're applying to get a HUC study, which sets up all the different watersheds throughout there and how they interact, and that's through the Army Corps of Engineers. But it's just another step that you go through in order to be able to have access to, state and federal monies to do that. So I don't know if that necessarily applies exactly with what you're saying, but I think if you want to have a well planned out wetland that's going to do the things that you want it to do, you probably need to have a good idea of, what the watersheds are in your community.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think I agree a lot with what Daryl was saying about just the cost of it and finding landowners, and I think related to that is just the permanency of it. Landowners are willing to do like a riparian buffer. It's only 10 years, but you put in all those structures and things with a wetland, and it's seen as kind of a permanent loss of farmland. And I don't know, I mean, maybe the wetland culture concept will help that way if you're switching it back and forth and saying that. But I mean, I think the second thing is just this whole, drainage law and the tile drainage system. People invest a lot of money in putting those tile drainage systems in there. You don't want to just rip them out. And I don't know, maybe there's some way to work around that too, with this design of it. But that's a huge barrier all over the Midwest, is trying to work with that drainage system. You can't flood adjacent lands. You have all the very dense tile drain network. I mean, infrastructure basically in the ground everywhere in these fields. That's expensive. So that's really, to me, coming kind of more the technical side, that's kind of one of the just main barriers.
We've had county engineers say, no, my job is to protect people from flooding, and you're not going to do something here. So there's a lot of obstacles to doing this. Use the mic because you won't. I'm sorry.
Are you done?
I was done, yeah.
Okay.
Just
Well, I want to add too that if you say wetlands to a farmer in the Western Lake Erie Basin, they automatically shut down because their great-grandfathers drained this. They suffered malaria. To them, it's just a mosquito-ridden area. We've had a wetlands at the back of our property, constructed one for 29 years now. And people, the first thing they always says, oh, don't you have mosquitoes? I said, no, I don't have mosquitoes. But to the farmers, they remember what their ancestors went through to drain this land. And okay, the Fulton County Extension agent, sorry, Eric, we mentioned wetlands to him, and he just said, oh, that's just a mosquito bog, So even someone with an education, their reaction to a wetlands is absolutely not. So, it's going to be a tough sell. There are people out there who are forward-thinking and understand that they're a good thing, but it's really going to be a tough sell to the farmers whose ancestors drained this area. So I think probably overcoming that attitude and then the financial side of it. Although, especially this year, farmers aren't going to make any money, except from the government, taxpayer money. But I also see this year as maybe an eye-opener for them that, hey, well, I can't put a crop in, but I could put a cover crop in, because most of them say, if you suggest, well, hey, maybe you should look into putting cover crops on your field, they're like, oh, I don't have time. I'm so busy in harvest, I don't have time to get it in. Well, this may be the year they can say, hey, I could try cover crops this year. And a lot of the farmers who, with all the rain this spring, had put cover crops on last fall, they weren't able to get in and kill it with herbicides before planting. Well, they learned they could go in and roll it and plant green. They could plant into that living cover crop. And for a lot of them, it worked well. So, maybe it takes a disastrous year like this year for them to see that, hey, maybe I could try something new. So, hopefully this helps.
And yeah, Linda, I agree with you. I think you hit on a really good point, which kind of reiterated something I said earlier, which is study the history. Because when you look at the history of a landscape and how it changed over time, yeah, you can read about the Great Black Swamp. I've read about it because it's pretty cool. And after I read some of the histories, I thought I would have been one of the people that would have been killed by some kind of mosquito-borne disease. I don't think I would have made it. So yeah, when you look at that history, I think it's it helps to inform you of why some people think the way they do about a landscape. And it's it's very informative, it's very helpful, so we can understand where people are at. When it comes to working in these areas, we have to meet people where they're at. So with that in mind, I think it's also important to realize just, finding willing sellers is also a challenge. But again, I can kind of understand why some private landowners are hesitant to sell, because in many cases, these are family farms. And when you have family property, that property is a part of your identity. So the choice to sell is also the choice of giving up a small piece of your family identity. I can relate to that completely because we had a family business in northern Kentucky when I was a kid. And when we had to, figure out what to do with that, it hurts. It's a very personal decision. And I think as we, present these opportunities to people, I think it's important to be aware of that, and that family identities are tied with the landscape, and there's also this big history that plays into it. So it's important to be very respectful of that. And I think it's also helpful if we can work with people to accept different aesthetics. There's a very accepted aesthetic of, mowed green grass along the roadways everywhere is like the most beautiful thing ever. And I think there are some opportunities to do some additional education about that in a very positive, very welcoming way. You never want to shame anybody for, the things that they accept as is. You want to provide positive, open opportunities to introduce a new idea and welcome them to it. So that's my thought.
I'm glad I'm commenting after Christina. So my comments in part might not apply to this landscape. I just have to consider what it's like in Florida. So our problem is people. And that, as Bill mentioned, so many people come to that landscape from someplace else. When I first arrived a couple decades ago, the data showed that at any given moment, more than 50% of the people had lived in Florida less than 5 years. So what Christina just said about not understanding the history, the problem is ignorance. And so I'm not sure that's true on your landscape, but it might be. And then the other, I think this is probably true of people all over, is inattention. That our lives are so busy, it's so hard to get through the day to be thinking about what might or might not happen a year or 10 years from now. It's a lot easier to pack that away. So I just turned 60. I'm thinking about the last, I hope, decade or more of my career, and I'm shifting a lot of my work away from publishing more papers to try to figure out the right way to communicate to people to move us towards a more sustainable future. And the projects that I'm working on have a lot to do with video. So we just finished data collection last week with this interesting piece of interdisciplinary groups of undergraduates shooting PSA-length videos about water issues in South Florida, asking them to focus some of them towards what might happen if we do nothing, trying to scare the crap out of people, or what are possible solutions that could engender and empower change. And so we worked with documentary filmmakers, the students shot the videos, we had teams that selected the best videos, and then during the summer we've been showing them to groups of undergraduates and assessing their impressions on them. So we have at FGCU we have a class on environmental education and sustainability that's required of all undergraduates. So I'm really excited about looking at that data. Preliminary stuff would seem to indicate that people can shoot more powerful videos that scare the crap out of people because we're used to that happening. And that it's probably going to turn out to work really effectively if you do it as a 1-2 punch. You scare them, and then you show them what they can do. The charge is to get people's attention without shoving them into despair. You got to convince them that we really can make a difference.
All right. So I'm going to go with a practical challenge, which is funding. But for us, it's not just any funding. There's money out there, GLRI, HU Ohio, and all sorts of others. But what I will call nimble funding is what we lack or would help a lot. So there's a lot of models already out there, TNC and USGS and all sorts of others that we can use to see what are the most restorable places and what are the spots in the landscape that doing wetland restoration or stream restoration is the most important. So we know where to do it, but then when those pieces of land come up for sale, you know, it might take 2 years to find money to buy it, and the landowner might not be willing to wait 2 years, even if they really are conservation minded and want to have the right kind of thing done on their land. So having money that's kind of there ready to just grab land when it's available, when it's the right land that's available, would be cool. And then another way I think of nimble funding that we need is, especially in the Western Lake Erie Basin, there's a whole lot of players who do this kind of work, who acquire land, restore land, manage land, but over and over and over again for the past 10 years I hear, oh, there's this piece of land that would be really good to preserve or to do a restoration on, who wants to own it and manage it? And we all put our hands down because, we all have a lot already on our plates. And so if there's also some nimble funding that could say, if you, take on 500 more acres, you can have money to hire a preserve manager for 5 years, something like that. So nimble funding is my challenge.
Well, thank you all for your input. I think it will certainly, help inform our outreach efforts as an organization. So thank you.
Can I give you one more bit of input before you go off here? Actually, we got our money from OWDA to buy the land that we could do our GLRI project on. And I will say, though, that I've given talks a lot to different organizations, and they're always farmers, and farmers always are the ones that come up to me and say, this is fantastic. We really want to help. We want to do something. So I'm crazy about the farming community. But at the same time, I don't really like putting the burden on those guys. And so we're talking about farmland, and I'm not always thinking about farmland when I'm thinking about kind of doing restoration. We're the people down, Toledo is where I'm located. We're the ones that actually have to deal with the lake and the problems that are down there, and we're looking at the farmers upstream to solve it for us a lot of times and for them to make the sacrifice. And that's not always something that I'm crazy about doing. Metro Parks actually at one time was going to give us their old canal to put the wetland in. And with the size that we could do at that location, we would have made a 10% reduction in the amount of phosphorus, which is coming down the Maumee River. There was not a Huck 19 plant, I forget which one it is, and we just did a bunch of those, but we didn't have a Huck 12? 12, yes, there wasn't a Huck 12, and at that time you had to have one in order to do the project at that location. And so we had to give it up and we couldn't do that. But I'm just saying there are other locations where you could actually do this as well. It doesn't necessarily always have to be the farmland. There's another, so this is Providence Metro Park. It's beautiful.
I know exactly what you're talking about. So.
Okay. Thank you all. This was a great discussion. I think. It's not on. It's on. Hey, you still heard me. That's cool. This is a very positive thing. What you guys, I think, knew was you were all recorded. And so if you said something, good or bad, we're going to write it down. We're going to mull over it. It will all make sense in the end. But I started a list here, and I scribbled all over my program, and now I can't read it. But some of the things that I heard, for example, that we've got to remember there's a climate changing in all of this. And they found out in the Everglades that they almost going to have to redraw the restoration plan down there because in the meantime, it's taken so long to fix the Everglades that now they have to change their method. They have to change everything. And that could be the case if we were to convert the black swamp and there's no more, or the rain patterns change or something like that. What I also heard is the devil's going to be in the detail, and we know that. So that's why we're trying to deal with concepts first, general concepts. And the general concept that I liked when I started all this wetland culture was Everglades Foundation got it right. They said we need to take the phosphorus out, or the nutrients in general, and we have to figure out how to get those nutrients back to society. That's the hard part. It's easy to take the nutrients out. It's hard to recycle them so that you don't have to continue to plaster more nutrients on the landscape. So I consider that the big challenge, and a lot of the comments were related to, well, the hydrology will be difficult. You're darn right it's going to be difficult, but I think we can we can do it, at least try. The farmers. I absolutely hope that we change the dialogue or monologue, if that's the case, that we're having with farmers, and that we really do develop almost a capitalistic model of money flow to people who do good things. If you clean up the water, you should be paid, period. And it doesn't necessarily have to come from the government. That's the other point. This could be a completely autonomous system. Well, it will never be totally autonomous, but at least it will be. So that, I consider the discussions that we've heard about dealing with the farming community absolutely incredibly good. It gives us great excitement to start reconstituting how we say things. We're always talking about taking land. Well, let's stop taking land. The farmer can keep the land and make money cleaning water instead of what's the difference between that and a cover crop? You know, in other words, it's an alternative way to make money on your land. The funding, we heard about that mostly this morning with the new program that the state's putting in. It's a great, great sign. You heard Wynn say that same thing is going on in Florida. All of a sudden, the government woke up to the fact that they're going to have to water is the #1 issue in Florida, and I'd say it's number 2 or 3 here, but it's pretty close to the top in Ohio too. And where did that come from? That came from the fact that we have an emergency situation almost with algal blooms everywhere. So there are a whole lot of other comments I have, but I'll stop there, but I'll repeat what I said earlier without the microphone, that absolutely this was a great discussion, and I appreciate the feedback so much. And we're going to try to go back to the drawing boards and come up with a better product. But I'm excited about what I heard from my colleagues, you know, because when you have to sit down and give a presentation like Sam did, he nailed it. And I think I'm very positive about everything in this conference. So thank you all for coming. Thank you all for coming. And just remember the 10-year space shot, 2029. We might have this done. Let's make that a model. Okay, thank you all.